Jake never believed he would end up on an alien warship. He was just a human engineer from Earth, good with machines, better with jokes. But now he was standing on the cold metal floor of the Valkyrie dreadnought, surrounded by tall, silent warriors, with glowing eyes and armor made of star-forged steel. They didn't talk to him much, didn't even look at him unless they had to. But Jake didn't mind. He liked being the strange human on board. At least until he saw her. Her name was Valixa. She was over 8 feet tall, strong like a beast, and moved like lightning. Her silver armor had black marks from battles, and her eyes glowed like hot plasma. Jake had seen her in action once during a pirate raid. She picked up a steel crate and threw it like it was a pillow, crushing 5 mercs in one move. No one dared stand in her way. No one dared speak to her. Except Jake. He first spoke to her during engine repairs. She was guarding the bay, arms crossed, helmet off, face unreadable. Jake was working under a power core, grumbling to himself when he crawled out. His eyes landed right on her armored backside. Without thinking, he said, "Hey, you've got a nice butt for a space war god." Silence. The other warriors nearby froze. One dropped his weapon. Another gasped. Valixa turned slowly to look at him. Her face showed no emotion for a second. Then she blushed. A faint purple glow spread over her cheeks. Jake barely had time to smile before her hand came flying. Wham! She slapped him so hard, his feet left the floor. He flew backward into a wall and landed in a pile of broken cables. Pain shot through his jaw, his shoulder, and his pride. But instead of crying, Jake started laughing. "Totally worth it," he mumbled. Valixa stood over him, staring. Then she walked away without a word. Everyone else avoided Jake for the rest of the day. They thought he was crazy, but that was only the beginning. After the slap, something strange started happening. Jake noticed Valixa more and more, not just in passing, but close. She began showing up wherever he went. Cafeteria, engine room, training areas, even near his sleeping quarters. She never spoke, never touched him again. But she was there, always. Nearby, always watching. One time, Jake tripped over a power line and almost fell into a plasma vent. Before he hit the ground, a strong hand grabbed him and pulled him back. It was Valixa. She didn't say anything, just nodded and walked away. Another time, during a ship lockdown, Jake got stuck in a corridor with flickering lights. He heard whispers, movement in the dark. Then a group of masked raiders rushed at him. He barely screamed before a silver blur slammed into them like a comet. Valixa crushed the intruders in seconds, one by one, without mercy. Blood on her armor, sparks in her eyes. Jake woke up later in the medbay, sore and confused. Beside his bed was a strange alien flower, dark blue with glowing veins. And in the corner of the room, sitting perfectly still, was Valixa. She didn't look at him, just sat there, silent like a statue. Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He reached for the flower, touched it carefully. "Did you bring this?" He whispered, no answer. But for the first time, he thought he saw something in her eyes. A question. Maybe a memory, or maybe something softer. From that day, the crew started whispering. Rumors flew like sparks in the engine room. "The warrior has chosen him," one said. "He's her bond," another guessed. Jake didn't know what any of it meant. All he knew was this: she was terrifying, mysterious, and beautiful in a way he didn't understand. And when she looked at him, even for a second, it felt like the stars paused in the sky. He remembered the slap, the way her hand cracked the air like thunder. He still had a bruise on his shoulder, but he also remembered that blush, the glow on her face, the moment of surprise. That was the moment everything changed, not just for Jake, but for her too. And deep in the shadows of the ship, something new was beginning, something strange, dangerous, and maybe something more. Jake didn't understand it at first. Ever since the slap, Valixa had become his silent shadow. She didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't even look at him directly, but she was there. Every single time, just close enough to feel her presence. He'd walk into the cafeteria and she'd already be in the corner. Arms crossed, staring at nothing. He'd head to the engine bay, and a few minutes later, she'd show up and stand near the exit. No words, no expression, just quiet watching. At first, Jake thought it was some kind of punishment. Maybe she was making sure he didn't talk to her again. But it didn't feel like that. It felt different, like something was shifting in the air around them. He joked about it to the crew, but they stopped laughing after a while. The other aliens seemed nervous whenever Velixa entered the room. One time, a fellow technician whispered, "She's watching you like a mate," and then walked away fast. Jake didn't even know if Velixa's species had the concept of mates. But the thought made his stomach twist. Not in fear, not really, in something else. Something strange and warm. Late one night, he couldn't sleep, so he took a walk through the lower decks. It was quiet, just the soft hum of the ship's engines and distant echoes. He stopped near a maintenance panel, fixing a loose wire. Suddenly, footsteps. He turned and saw her standing at the far end of the hall. Her armor was darker in the shadows, her eyes glowing faintly. She didn't move, just stood there like a ghost. Jake felt his heart race, but not from fear. He took a breath and said, "Are you gonna just keep following me? Or do I need to leave you another compliment?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, but again, no words. Then she turned and walked away. Jake was left alone with only the sound of his own breath and the smell of burnt circuits. The next day, something worse happened. Jake was called to fix a power surge in a dark corridor near the old storage sectors. As he knelt to work, the lights flickered, then failed. Silence followed, thick and cold. Then footsteps. But not Velixa's. 3 figures stepped out of the dark, tall, armed, faces hidden under black masks. Raiders had boarded the ship in secret, and now he was their target. He backed up slowly, hands raised, joking weakly. "Hey guys, I'm just the wrench guy." One raider raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the corridor exploded in silver light. Velixa came crashing down from above, blade in hand, fury in her eyes. She didn't speak, didn't pause. She tore through them like a storm. Jake could only crawl away, watching her fight with deadly grace. It was like watching lightning wrapped in armor. When it was over, 2 raiders were unconscious, the third missing half his helmet. Velixa stood over Jake, her armor scorched, breathing heavy. She looked down at him, reached out, and touched his chest lightly to check if he was hurt. Then she picked him up like he weighed nothing and carried him out. He didn't even remember blacking out. The medbay was quiet when he opened his eyes. Dim lights above, a soft beeping sound. His body ached, but he was alive. On the table beside him was a strange object, an alien flower, deep blue, glowing faintly. It pulsed softly like it was breathing. And in the corner of the room, sitting silently, was Velixa. She wasn't wearing her helmet, just her armor, her silver hair tied back. She sat still, hands resting on her knees, not looking at him. Jake tried to sit up, winced, then looked at her. "Hey," he whispered, voice dry. "Was that you? With the flower?" She didn't answer, but her eyes shifted slightly. Not a yes, not a no. Just a small flicker of something. He stared at the flower, unsure why it made him feel strange. Like it meant something, something more than words. He reached toward it but stopped halfway. "Why me?" he asked, not expecting an answer. To his surprise, she stood up slowly and walked to his bedside. She looked at him for a long moment, then finally said one word, quiet and low, "Protected." Then she turned and walked out. Jake lay there, stunned, the flower glowing next to his hand. Protected. She didn't say saved or rescued. She said protected, like it was a promise, like it meant more than just that night. And in that moment, Jake knew something was happening. Something deep, something powerful, and something he couldn't explain yet. But whatever it was, it had just begun. Jake woke up to alarms blaring and red lights spinning. The ship was not under attack, but something serious was happening. A high-priority order had been sent from the command corps. Jake was told to report immediately to the trial chamber. He rubbed his eyes, still recovering from his injuries, and limped his way there. He didn't know what to expect. But when the doors opened, he saw her. Velixa was already standing in the center of the room, silent and still. Around her, high-ranking officers and elder warriors stood like statues. Everyone turned to look at Jake as he entered. One of the elders spoke in a deep voice. "The warrior has chosen the human for bonding evaluation." Jake blinked, confused. "What's a bonding evaluation?" The officer closest to him leaned in and whispered, "It's a mind-link trial. Only used when a warrior sees a possible life-mate or soul ally." Jake's heart skipped. Life-mate? He looked at Velixa, her face unreadable as always. He wanted to ask why or what this meant, but there was no time. The chamber darkened, and two glowing rings appeared on the floor, one around him, one around her. The air thickened, and he felt something pull inside his head. Then a flash. He was no longer standing in the room. He was falling into memories that weren't his. He saw Velixa as a young warrior barely trained, crying beside a broken sword. He saw her kneeling in front of a burning temple, her people lying still. He felt her anger, her pain, her silence. She had lost everyone and built walls so high no one could ever reach her. Until now. Then it flipped. Velixa was seeing his memories. Jake as a boy, chasing birds through a scrapyard, falling off a roof while trying to impress a girl with a stupid dance, laughing with his little sister under the stars, fixing broken gadgets to make them sing. She saw his loneliness too, but not because of war. His came from being too different, never taken seriously, always the clown. Their emotions tangled like wires, fear, joy, pain, laughter. Everything twisted together. The visions faded. And suddenly Jake was back in his body. He dropped to his knees, gasping. Velixa was standing tall, breathing hard, sweat on her brow. The room was dead silent. Then she turned to the council and spoke a single word, "compatible." A long pause followed. One of the elders coughed. "This changes things," another whispered. "The first time a human has passed the trial." Jake stood up slowly, still dizzy. He looked at Velixa, unsure what to say. She didn't smile, but her gaze softened for just a second. After the ceremony, Jake was escorted back to his room. Everything felt unreal, like he had stepped into a different world. He kept replaying the memory of her as a child, lonely and fierce, and her seeing him fall on his face while dancing. He laughed to himself. "Great. I just bonded with a deadly alien warrior by letting her watch my most embarrassing memories." He turned his head and gasped. Velixa was already in his room, sitting quietly by the wall. He didn't hear her come in. She looked at him, then placed something small on his desk. It was a shard of her armor, dark silver with markings he didn't recognize. She stood, nodded once, and left without a word. Jake picked it up and turned it over in his hand. There was a warmth to it, not just metal. He remembered someone saying long ago that Varkari warriors only gave armor shards to one person in their lives, someone they trust completely. His hand closed around it. He didn't know what this meant exactly. He didn't know what came next, but he knew this wasn't just a silent shadow anymore. She had chosen him in her own quiet, strange, terrifying way, and something inside him had chosen her too. Jake didn't mean to insult the commander. He was just trying to be funny, like always. But aliens didn't always understand jokes, especially proud ones with horns and huge egos. The words had barely left his mouth when silence spread across the training hall like a cold wind. Gorek, the unit commander, turned slowly, eyes glowing with fury. "You mock me, human," he growled, his voice like grinding stone. Jake raised his hands. "I'm just saying. Maybe your war cry sounds a little like a cow in pain." A dozen warriors gasped. Velixa didn't move, but Jake could feel her eyes on him. The challenge was issued before Jake could blink. A duel, witnessed by the crew. Refuse, and he would lose all respect, including Velixa's accept, and he might end up in a body cast. He looked at her then, hoping she'd stop it. But she only tilted her head slightly, watching. It wasn't permission. It wasn't rejection. It was trust. The fight took place in the combat circle at midship. Hundreds gathered to watch, most expecting Jake to lose in under a minute. Gorak stood tall with a blade as long as Jake's arm, armored from head to foot. Jake wore a padded vest and held a short stun rod, his hands already sweating. This wasn't a fair fight, and everyone knew it. But Jake wasn't planning to fight fair. He dodged the first strike, barely, and rolled behind a crate. He remembered where the weak floor panel was. He had repaired it last week. He led Gorak right over it, jumped back, and hit the override on his wrist pad. The panel opened under Gorak's foot, just enough to throw him off balance. Jake used the moment to jab the stun rod into his side. Sparks flew. Gorak roared. The crowd shouted in surprise. Jake didn't stop. He ran in circles, sliding between boxes, jumping wires. He threw tools, yelled insults, anything to keep Gorak angry and distracted. At last, Gorak charged, slipped on spilled oil, and crashed hard into a metal beam. Jake pounced and held the rod to his neck. The duel was over. Silence, then a slow, rising roar from the crowd. Some laughed, some cheered, others simply stared. Jake stepped back, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face. He expected to be tackled, maybe dragged away. Instead, he saw her. Valixa walked forward, her armor gleaming. She looked at Gorak on the floor, then at Jake, and she growled. Not at Jake, but at the commander. Warning, the other warriors stepped back in shock. She stood beside Jake, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. That meant something here, something deep. Jake didn't understand all the rules, but he felt the weight of her action. She had chosen a side, and it was his, that night, while everyone else celebrated or argued. Jake returned to his room. He needed air, peace, silence, anything to calm the storm in his head. He didn't notice the figure waiting inside until the door shut behind him. Valixa stood in the corner, helmet off, eyes glowing soft. She walked toward him and held out her hand. In her palm was a shard of her own armor, polished and etched with strange symbols. She placed it in his hand gently, then closed his fingers. Around it, Jake stared at it, then at her. What does this mean? He whispered. She didn't speak, but her eyes answered something deeper than words. Then she turned and left as quietly as she came. Jake looked down at the shard, feeling the warmth of it in his skin. It wasn't just a gift, it was a message. Not just of trust, not just of honor. It was something personal, ancient, maybe even sacred. And holding it, he finally understood that this strange, fearsome warrior was no longer just a shadow in armor. She was becoming part of his story, and he was becoming part of hers. Jake followed the sound of music, soft and strange, drifting through the lower decks like a whisper. He wasn't supposed to be down here, not this deep in the ship, but his wrist scanner had picked up a power signal in a restricted zone, and curiosity always won with him. The halls were dim and empty, the walls older than the rest of the ship, covered in markings and scratches he didn't recognize. He turned a corner, expecting a control panel or maybe a broken vent. Instead, he froze there. Alone in a round room lit by blue lanterns sat Valixa. Her armor was set neatly beside her, and she wore simple robes, something soft, something human-like. In her hands was a small brush, and in front of her, a wide cloth stretched across a metal frame. She was painting. Not war, not fire, not blood, but a quiet scene. Mountains with floating trees, a river that shimmered under a pink sky, two suns resting above the peaks. Jake didn't move, afraid to disturb whatever rare moment he had just walked into. She didn't turn around, but she spoke without looking. You shouldn't be here. Her voice was calm, quiet, almost tired. Jake stepped forward anyway, slowly. I thought you were all blade in battle, he said softly. Didn't expect you to carry a paintbrush. She finally looked back at him, her eyes different this time. Not glowing bright, but soft like moonlight. "This is my world," she said, pointing to the painting. Before the wars, Jake sat on the floor beside her, careful not to touch anything. "I didn't know you missed it," he whispered. "No one ever asked," she replied. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the ship barely reaching this far. Then Velixa picked up a small device and pressed it. A slow earth melody began to play. When Jake recognized a lullaby, she looked at him again, her voice lower. "You played this in your memory," he smiled, surprised. "You remembered that?" She nodded. "It was peaceful," she said almost shyly. They talked for the first time, not about war, not about survival, but about dreams. She asked him what Earth tasted like, what snow felt like, what it meant to fall asleep without checking for enemies. He told her stories, dumb ones, sad ones. Funny ones. She listened, sometimes with a slight tilt of her head, sometimes with the faintest smile. Then the alert blared. A red signal filled the room. "Urgent and sharp. Colony under siege," the voice announced. "All combat units report." Velixa stood immediately, grabbing her armor, all softness gone in a breath. But before leaving, she turned to Jake, eyes steady. "If I fall today, remember this place," she said. Jake stood too, heart pounding. "Don't talk like that," he said, trying to keep his voice light. She stepped closer, and for the first time, touched his face with the back of her hand. "I've lived through war," she whispered, "but I've never lived through hope." Then she was gone, running toward the hangar bay, her figure disappearing like a star fading in daylight. Jake stood alone in the quiet room, the painting still unfinished. He stared at the soft river, the floating trees, the twin suns. Then he looked at the spot where she had sat and felt the echo of something powerful grow in his chest. Not fear, not panic, but the sharp pain of caring, and the deeper fear of losing what he had only just begun to find. Asterisk smoke burned his lungs, and the sound of plasma fire cracked through the sky. Jake wasn't supposed to be there. The colony was under heavy attack, buildings crumbling, alien civilians running for cover. But when the comms cut out and no one could tell him where Velixa was, he didn't think, he just ran. He grabbed a blaster and sprinted straight off the ship before anyone could stop him. He had never seen real war before, not like this. The air stank of ash and burning metal. Bodies lay broken in the streets. Explosions rocked the ground under his boots, but all he could think about was her. Where was she? Was she okay? Was she even still alive? Then he saw her. Velixa stood in the middle of the battlefield, her silver armor scorched black. Her helmet cracked, surrounded, 10 against 1, but still standing tall. She moved like thunder, one sweep of her blade, one scream, one more body falling. But even warriors get tired, even gods can bleed. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as he saw a sniper on the rooftop behind her. No one else saw. No one else could stop it. He didn't think. He ran. He shouted her name. But the shot had already been fired. Time slowed. The plasma bolt glowed hot blue, flying fast and deadly. Jake threw himself forward, arms out, body burning with fear and courage. The bolt struck him in the side. Everything turned white. Pain, more than he had ever felt, swallowed him. He hit the ground hard, gasping. The world tilted, voices blurred, but one sound rose above all, a roar. Not human, not like anything he had heard before. Velixa. She turned and saw him on the ground, her eyes going wide. Then she moved, not like a warrior, but like something ancient and wild. She leapt through the air, her blade spinning, her body crashing through enemies like they were paper. Someone tried to pull Jake away, but he couldn't feel his legs. Blood pooled under him, hot and thick. He saw Velixa tearing the sniper's rifle apart with her bare hands. She looked at Jake then, dropped everything, and ran to him. "Stay awake," she said. Kneeling beside him, her voice was shaking, her hands trembling. Jake smiled through the pain. "You're yelling." "I'm not," she said, voice cracking. "You're panicking," he whispered, coughing. She looked down at his wound, pressed something against it. "Why did you do that?" she asked, almost angry. He winced. Because you're important, her breath caught. No one's ever said that to me before. She whispered. Everything after that was flashes, lights above him, pressure on his chest. Voices calling for medics. He faded in and out. Once he thought he saw her holding his hand. Another time he felt her forehead resting against his. He woke up in the ship's medical bay. Floating in a healing pod, his body was stiff but alive, and sitting outside the glass, motionless and silent, was Valixa, still in her damaged armor, blood on her hands, eyes dull but locked on him. The pod opened with a hiss, and the cold air wrapped around him. She stood slowly, unsure. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She stepped forward, placed her hand on his, and said nothing. No jokes, no speeches. Just silence, thick with meaning. After a long moment, she spoke. I don't know what this feeling is, she said, voice low, but I know it started with you. Jake squeezed her fingers, weak but smiling. I think it's called not wanting to lose someone. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. I would have destroyed every ship in orbit if you had died, she whispered. He blinked. Surprised. Wow, he whispered. That's oddly romantic. She leaned closer, and for the first time, rested her forehead gently against his. Neither of them moved. And in that quiet space between life and death, something unspoken finally settled between them. She stood at his door without armor, no helmet, no weapons, just her tall figure wrapped in soft black fabric and silver cords around her wrists. Jake stared for a full 5 seconds before speaking. You lost your armor, he said, blinking. Valixa tilted her head. I left it behind. He stepped aside, still wearing a medical wrap under his shirt, still healing from the blast. She walked in slowly, like she didn't trust the room to hold her weight. Or maybe she didn't trust herself. There were no alarms, no war cries, no blaster fire. Just the hum of the ship in deep space cruise mode. The war was over, at least for now. Valixa had stepped down from command. She didn't tell anyone why. But Jake had a feeling it had something to do with what she said at the medbay, and the quiet way she looked at him since then. He sat down on the edge of his bunk and watched her scan the room like she was memorizing it. Her eyes landed on the flower he kept in a glass case, the one she once left beside his bed. Then her gaze moved to the shard of armor he now wore around his neck on a string. She walked closer, silent as always, until she stood in front of him. Jake smiled nervously. So are you here to say goodbye, or slap me again? She didn't laugh, not with sound, but her lips twitched slightly, and something warm passed through her expression. Then she did something Jake never expected, not even in his most ridiculous dreams. She leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't long or deep, it was quick, awkward, and just a little too sharp, like she didn't quite know what to do. But Jake kissed her back anyway, eyes wide, heart racing, and then she slapped him again. Not hard like the first time, not enough to send him flying, but enough to make his head tilt, enough to sting. He rubbed his cheek and looked at her with mock pain. Seriously? She looked straight at him and said, That's for making me care. He laughed, even though it hurt a little. I guess I earned that. Valixa sat down beside him for the first time. Not as a warrior, not as a shadow, but just as someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and was still learning how to live. They sat there in silence for a long time, his shoulder resting gently against hers. No words were needed, not anymore. Later, as the ship reached Earth orbit, Jake stood beside her at the viewing bay. The blue planet below shimmered like a jewel. Valixa looked at it with wide eyes, like a child seeing the sky for the first time. Jake nudged her arm. Want to see snow? She nodded slowly. And oceans, he grinned. You're in luck, we have both. As they walked down the ramp toward Earth's surface, no one cheered, no fanfare, just quiet steps and clean air. But that was enough. Behind them, the stars still burned with battles, but ahead of them was something else, something rare, not just peace, not just rest, but the beginning of something strange and beautiful. Jake looked up at her and said, "You still have a nice butt, by the way." She turned her head slightly, expression unreadable. Then she smacked the back of his head and kept walking. He laughed and followed, his heart lighter than it had ever been. And somewhere deep in the sky, a ship flew silently, carrying the memory of a warrior who blushed once and the human who made her do it.